Soul to Soul, Black Expressive Cultures in the Fight Against the Muslim Ban. My name is Mubashir Rizvi. I'm Assistant Professor in Department of Anthropology at Georgetown University, and today I'll be giving a talk about the Muslim ban. I argue that the most effective challenge to the Muslim ban will not emerge in the courtroom, but through a sustained and cultural political engagement with the history of Islam in America. Now, it doesn't take long to remember that Donald Trump's candidacy was very much built around Islamophobia and xenophobia against immigrant communities. Within the first week of office, the Trump administration signed the Executive Order 13769, protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. The Executive Order, more colloquially known as the travel ban or the Muslim ban, restricts travel and refugee settlement from 7 Muslim-majority countries to immigrants or refugees. However, one of the most inspiring and unexpected events that took place right after the signing of this ban late afternoon in January 27th, 2017, was the spontaneous upsurge of protests that started taking place all over the country as ordinary people, coalitions, community organizations headed to their local airports, the public squares, and the high courts demanding political intervention to stop the targeting and discrimination against immigrant communities, particularly Muslim Americans and their loved ones. The upsurge in protests and the subsequent litigation by civil liberty groups led to a temporary stay in the ban, as the high courts in Hawaii, New York, and Maryland accepted the constitutional challenges to the ban. The temporary stay in the ban was removed, and the Muslim ban was reinstated on June 26, 2018, when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled by a 5-4 majority, upholding President Trump's executive order and accepted the government's case about the unique threats posed by immigrants from the targeted Muslim-majority countries. The court's ruling therefore reinforced the image of Islam as a foreign religion and the image of Muslims as a unique national security threat. The Trump versus Hawaii ruling joins a sordid history of Supreme Court decisions. The precedents go back to the Dred Scott case of 1857, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the 1917 Immigration Act, the Asian Exclusion Act, and the 1944, the most recent Korematsu case. Justice Sotomayor wrote a powerful dissent objecting to the majority's ruling, where she warned that the ruling in effect masquerades behind a facade of national security concerns and paints Muslim immigrants as a unique security threat. Sotomayor argued that the court's ruling violates the Establishment Clause by discriminating against a minority religion, and it opens up the potential for the wholesale internment of a minority community, much like the case in World War II. Chief Justice Roberts defended the majority ruling by arguing that the court is not driven by racial or religious animus against American citizens or residents, but rather in deference to executive office's authorities to protect the homeland from foreign nationals. Judge Robert doesn't ask the government to justify its criteria, since no citizens of any banned countries has been ever involved or associated with a terror attack on American soil. The court's majority ruling, however, reiterates the image of Islam as a foreign religion by casting Muslims out of the constitutional protections and the tenets of equality before the law. In this talk, I suggest that one of the tactics to challenge the Muslim ban requires scholars and activists to foreground the legacy of Islam as a creative and critical force in the American history. In this approach, I take inspiration from a wide range of scholarship on African American Islam, Asian American studies, and also the broader tradition of Black internationalism in challenging the tenets of American exceptionalism or what has been called American racial capitalism. The Muslim ban will remain in place as long as Islam is viewed through the Orientalist lens as a menacing foreign religion that cannot be assimilated. Yet, for a large segment of African American Muslims, the oldest segment of the Muslim American community, Islam is not a foreign religion, but a part of the Black radical tradition of self-determination. The discussion of Islam in this tradition dates back 4 centuries to the history of enslaved African Muslims. It is a story of abductions, resistance, resilience, remembrance, and great migrations. A legacy of loss and recovery that is evident in the evocative name given by Elijah Muhammad to his organization, Lost Foundations of Islam in the Wilderness of North America, and in Malcolm X's brilliance. It is embodied in the communion between Arab, South Asian, European, African, and African American communities, as well as the rifts along ethnic and sectarian lines. Islam in America affords new horizons for being and belonging that have little to do with the dominant national ideologies of American exceptionalism or white supremacy. This multidimensional aspect of Islam in America has remained indecipherable to the Supreme Court and to mainstream America because it has evolved behind the color line, where the political imaginary of freedom, self-definition, and agency is not wrapped up in the narrative of American exceptionalism. Moreover, as the recent scholarship by Mustafa Bayoumi, Junaid Rana, Suad Abdul Khabir, Hisham Aidi, and Sohail Dolatzai points to the broader historical and diasporic role played by African American experience of Islam in the formation of anti-racist internationalism that veers away from the liberal narratives of racial redemption through multiculturalism. In this paper, I'm very much building on top or in conversation with the scholars that I have mentioned here, who have been making a case about a more multidimensional and a deeply historical and often overlooked history of Islam in America. It is a story which is integral to the liberation theology of Black nationalism, yet it has been flexible enough to question the starkness of the color line. It is a social glue for recently arrived immigrant communities making their way through the hostile terrain of contemporary America, yet it provides a lens to imagine a universal community outside of Euro-American centricism. Specifically, I focus on the cultural and musical expressions of jazz and hip-hop, which have served as an important pathway for the transmission of knowledge and history about race, religion, and identity. Before proceeding with this analysis, I should briefly pause and locate myself and my own relationship to this tradition. Here I'm drawing on my own experiences as a Pakistani immigrant who landed in Staten Island, New York as a preteen. And here I am in a photograph with my younger siblings as we are making our way from Karachi to America. And it's a layover in Paris, I think. The New York that I arrived in late 1987, early 1988, was remarkably different from the picture of America I had imagined from television shows, movies, and music videos. I had imagined the United States to be something like the set of The Karate Kid, the Goonies films, the Michael Jackson music videos, which had dominated our imagination about America in kind of a middle-class households of Karachi. But the New York that I arrived in was going through a crack epidemic. It was the height of the crack era. And my family moved to the northern side of Staten Island, New York, near the West Brighton projects. It was a poor neighborhood, and it took me a while to understand what poverty looked like in America. There was not the case of material deprivations of the scale that I was used to seeing in terms of the picture of poverty in Pakistan. but rather a sense of marginalization, isolation, surveillance, and control that was the case in New York at that time. It was the time of war on drugs. It did not take long to understand that the divide and the disparities between the predominantly black public housing projects and the more roomier, affluent, tree-lined streets with well-kept lawns that were only a few blocks away. My walk to school was the starkest reminder of this de facto segregation. As I traversed near the projects on Broadway to IS 27, I joined a long line of black and brown kids walking up from these projects, and the white kids coming in from the other side. All of us walking through the same doors into the same school from different worlds. I turned to hip hop to understand my surroundings, the wordplay, the beats, the rhythms, and the style that resonated so powerfully on the streets. It took some time for me to catch on. Initially, the rhythms, the storytelling, the call and response reminded me of the folk oral traditions of my own youth and culture, and I went so far as to claim that we had hip hop in Pakistan. It was my way to fit into the social world as a not black, not white person of color. It was through these samples and shoutouts by KRS-One that I learned about Malcolm X. I was fascinated by the Muslim salutations, Assalamu alaikum, by the poor righteous teachers, and the recurring allusions to Mecca, Medina, and the music referring to Islam, Muslims, by Big Daddy Kane and the Brand Nubians. The references to Islam were not actually central to my appreciation of the music, but it provided a sense of connection, a sense of recognition of a shared vocabulary. Recent scholarship has started to analyze the influence of Islam as a floating signifier in the making of black popular culture. My interest in these passing references to Allah and Quran was therefore based on something historical. Sylviane Diouf has analyzed the striking resemblances between the West African calls to prayer and the earliest Mississippi Delta blues recordings like Levi Kamphaler, and that share a similar melody to the call to prayer, as I mentioned, from the West Africa. Words that seem to quiver and shake, the dramatic changes in the musical scales and intonation. Robert Dannon and Mustafa Bayoumi have analyzed the spiritual turn of jazz musicians who were influenced by Islam and the Eastern sounds in the 1940s. Bayoumi has written about the early influence of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community on jazz musicians in the 1950s. Swat Abdul Qadir has commented on the influence of black Muslim traditions in the formations of hip-hop culture. And Hisham Aidi has argued about the influence of black expressive cultures on North African and South Asian diaspora cultures of young immigrants who are navigating through racial worlds of New Europe. These multiple meanings derived from Islam articulate new understandings of race or anti-racism based on beliefs, immigrant experiences, sartorial style, connections with black historical experience, and affinity with Africa, the Middle East, and Asia in Euro-America. The cultural expressions of Islam can be simultaneously a metonym for racial essentialism, as in the theology of Nation of Islam, and at the same time stand for a more universal community which might stand outside of the black and white binaries that continue to view blackness with pity, if not contempt. Islam in America breaks out of these stark binaries to explore the shades in between the black and the white and beyond the Western racial lens. My aim in this article is not to posit Islam as a solution for transcending racial violence in the West, but rather to analyze the historicity of Islam in the Black radical tradition, its roots and routes are what Saad Abdul Kabir calls the loop, a sampling of influences that's reflected in the different expressions of Islam in the Black expressive culture. Yet this century-old relationship of Black Atlantic Islam has come under suspicion in the post-9/11 era, culminating in the Muslim ban ruling. As several scholars have argued, the American definition of race is troubled by the presence of Muslims and their place in the racial hierarchy of the United States. For example, enslaved African Muslims who were literate in Arabic in antebellum America were routinely classified as Moors and elevated to prominent positions of plantation managers, and thus by removing them from other African enslaved communities who were more closely identified with the tribal or regional identities. This move preserved the racial hierarchy of chattel slavery by differentiating between so-called quote-unquote real Africans and Moors to maintain the perception that Africans lacked literacy and history. The object of chattel slavery was to break any bonds of kinship and religions and deny the African community any intellectual rights. Thus, the prospect of literate Africans who could correspond in a language that went beyond the tribal or regional, and a language that was not intelligible to plantation owners, was threatening and thus had to be managed through hierarchical modes of differentiation. Conversely, Islam also factored as a racial category in the determination of the limits of whiteness, as Arabs, Turks, and Indians from West Asia started to apply for naturalization in the early and middle parts of the 20th century. The fate of these petitions often hinged on the applicant's confessional identity. For instance, Muslim applicants who might be applying from what were the Ottoman territories might be routinely denied, whereas their compatriot Armenian and Syrian Christians, for instance, applying from the same region would gain naturalization and recognition as whites. However, the emergence of Muslims as a racial type also generated creative alternative possibilities for African American musicians and artists, travelers, to parochialize the strictures of color line. As Robert Dannon has noted, Muslim jazz musicians in the early 20th century routinely ignored the Jim Crow laws or subverted them by claiming to be Muslim and not Negro, and thus demanding service in white-only restaurants and bars and cafes while on tour. The jazz musicians' embrace of Islam was not explicitly political, as artists like Yusuf Lateef started experimenting with Eastern sounds, instruments, and musical compositions to create a different sound and mood in jazz. Lateef used instruments like the North Indian shehnai, bamboo flutes, traditional European oboe, and the arghal from Middle East to create music that was honest without being kitschy and spiritual without being exotic in its emotional tempo and content. This movement of jazz, exemplified by Yusuf Lateef, Art Blakey, and their companions John Coltrane and Dizzy Gillespie, who played with and were influenced by many Muslim musicians, broadened the scope of jazz from the swing, dancehall, and bandstand traditions to create a genre of jazz that was inward-looking, like bebop, but also powerfully honest in conveying the feelings of those heady times. The popularity of Islam among jazz musicians was editorialized in Life and Jet magazines in the 1950s. Dizzy wrote admiringly of Muslim jazz musicians' creative independence and their role in expanding the repertoire of music beyond the conventions of jazz, blues, and gospel. Dizzy was also noted that the musicians defied the rules of segregation and imposed discriminatory pay scales and demanded copyright protections over their records. Ironically, this post-war and intensely worldly sound of jazz with African rhythms and Islamic inspirations or Muslim inspirations, collaborations and improvisations represented an alternative to the stodgy sounds of classical music. However, the link between jazz and Islam was never as explicit as it became in hip-hop. The success of jazz and even broader reach of hip-hop signals the partial success of civil rights era to mainstream what was essentially a black vernacular tradition into the anthem for American popular culture and cultural globalization. Hip-hop has certainly gone from its improvised and grassroots origins to a multi-billion-dollar global industry in a relatively short time. Islam was injected early into this eclectic mix with the involvement of pioneers like Afrika Bambaataa, spoken word poets like The Last Poets, DJ Africa Islam, Kool Moe Dee, who were drawn to the calls for self-definition and self-determinism in the messages of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Yet, the definitions of Islam remain plural as it referred to over 32 different sects. This fluid understanding of Islam enables a diverse range of ideas of being and belonging, of self and community, solidarities that have little connections to the dominant national cultures. The line between the heterodox Islamic beliefs and the orthodox practices are constantly blurred in rap lyrics, where rappers like from the earliest days like Rakim would invoke Ayatollah Khomeini to show their anti-imperialist stance while invoking the creation stories of Nation of Islam. In Casualties of War, Rakim narrates the experiences of a black Muslim soldier who has been recruited into the Desert Storm circa 1991. The lyrics draw a picture about the growing doubts of an ambivalent soldier waiting with his platoon to invade Iraq. A range of feelings goes through this young man as he thinks about the purpose of the mission. He thinks about the meaning of the fighting for a country where his ancestors were brought enslaved, and about the meaning of being black in a part of the world that has some kinship with his ancestors. These conflicting feelings well up when he thinks about the monopoly game that drives the war and the solidarity he as a Muslim soldier shares with Saddam. This song was released at a time of patriotic fervor in the aftermath of Desert Storm campaign in 1992. The lyrics locate the soldier protagonist both inside and outside of America in a way that shows the multiple ways that Islam is invoked in hip-hop. Rakim's last album, in partnership with his longtime collaborator Eric B., represents a threshold in the transformation of hip-hop from its roots in inner cities to the growing market in the predominantly white middle class in suburbia. The invocations of Islam and hip-hop have gained a new significance in the post-9/11 era. Today, Muslim youth in Europe and America are living through what Mustafa Bayoumi reminds us is a replay of W.E.B. Du Bois's century-old question of racial interpolation. How does it feel to be a problem? The double consciousness of race in Muslim and black diasporas has emerged with the rhetoric of wars, the destructive clash of civilization narratives that have prefigured the contemporary wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the spectral war and terror, everyday ordinary surveillance of young people, or this constant media productions like Homeland that promote ideas of sleeper cells and whatnot. The carceral state policies that were put in place to fight the war on drugs and disproportionately targeted inner city youth for minor infractions were replicated and expanded in different ways in torture chambers of Afghanistan and Iraq. These tactics of mass incarceration, collective punishment and warehousing were applied in the war zones of Iraq, Guantanamo Bay. The anxieties about race and religion culminated in 2008 as Barack Obama's candidacies gained momentum. So here, this question of what culminates as the other becomes really significant, because in Barack Obama's candidacy, it was not his phenotype or his skin color of his skin that was singled out, but his proximity to Islam or his foreignness, which was not only directly tied to his skin color, but his middle name, Hussein. Thus, the explicit cultural logic of racism shifted in part from exclusively the color line to what we can call the cultural religious borderlines. Obama's campaign did not call out the Islamophobic rhetoric, but rather emphasized his own personal distance from Islam and the Muslim world by honing on his personal Christian faith and his Midwestern folksiness, and through his kinship with his, maternal grandparents. The Obama administration continued foreign and domestic policies that placed disproportionate focus on Muslim communities as the source of violence, both in domestic surveillance programs like countering violence extremism, as well as the expansion of the global war and terror from Iraq to Afghanistan, in Libya and Somalia and Syria. So here I'm actually talking not only of the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also the expansion of the global war on terror and drone strikes to a much broader terrain throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa. These policies ignored the destabilizing effects of foreign interventions, and domestically, they also ignored the proliferation of right-wing violence, school shootings that have claimed more lives in the United States than extremists acting in the name of Islam. Some of the strongest critiques of Obama presidency, however, came from the hip-hop community. Muslim rappers, particularly like Lupe Fiasco and Yasin Bey, who brought an international perspective to criticize Obama's policies. The Chicago-based rapper Lupe Fiasco in particular created a stir when he was booted off of President Obama's 2012 re-election inauguration party, one of many inauguration parties. But Lupe had gone on stage to perform a song, Words I Never Said, where he describes Obama's complicity with the war profiteering and the cost of such wars in the Middle East, as well as the future of American youth, and most insidiously, how Obama's presidency gives a certain legitimacy that makes one scared to speak truth about these wars. Lupe's principled but lonely critique of Obama's foreign policy and its corrosive effects on the daily life in America speaks to the internationalism that was championed by Malcolm X. In fact, rappers and musicians who explicitly identify with the Black Muslim tradition, like Lupe Fiasco and Yasin Bey, publicly called out President Obama's continuation of the global war on terror. And both of these rappers paid a big price for it. Yasin Bey, better known as Mos Def, also Bey collaborated with the human rights organizations Reprieve to undergo a force-feeding session that was routinely used to break hunger strikes by Guantanamo Bay detainees. The impact of Lupe and Yasin Bey's activism cannot be measured through the record sales, but rather by their ability to maintain and continue the legacy of internationalism and their message which has inspired politically engaged rappers in Europe and in France. Lupe's refrains from Words I Never Said has been remixed by the British Iraqi rapper Low Key in the song Obama Nation, where he remixes Lupe Fiasco with M1 from Dead Prez to talk about the ongoing buildup of wars and the renewal of empire under the first Black presidency. Thus, the question of race and empire is reworked in ways where true racial justice will require restoration of humanity to the Palestinians, the Iraqis, the Yemenis, a position that is too often reserved for only some lives that come to matter. Lupe Fiasco shows one way of breaking out of the heartlessness of imperial citizenship that condones militarized borders while ignoring the violence inflicted abroad. He does it by retelling the story of Alan Kurdi, the little boy whose dead body washed ashore in Turkey when the ferry carrying his family capsized as they tried to seek refuge in Greece. The song Alan Forever tells a story from the point of view where Alan never drowned. Instead, Alan survives the swim by simply holding his breath. The song starts with a serene piano intro, sounds of children laughing and playing in the background at a beach. Then Lupe starts the song as Alan. Alan calls Janila to tell her about his latest success. Janila here is Janila Watkins, the 6-month-old baby from Chicago who was shot and killed in a gang-related shooting in March 2013. Lupe imagines Janila, like Alan, has survived to adulthood and she's an emergency doctor now. Lupe, the narrator, comes back to fill in the picture about Alan's day as he talks to Janila. Alan Forever brings together the senseless killing of 2 young children and tries to imagine a world where their potential was realized, where they came together, where they rescued others through talents and determination. The song alludes to Muslim ethics, especially when Janila refuses Alan's invitation to travel the world with him. She reminds him about school and his Muslim obligation to get married first. Moreover, the blessings of saving a life will get Alan into heaven, raise his health, and provide him with blessings and wealth. The real salvation. These allusions break across national and cultural barriers in creating a feeling of conviviality, friendship, and potential of children from all corners of the world, from Kurdistan to Chicago, to actualize their potential. This naive-sounding tragic myth is one that goes in the very opposite direction of the myth of national security that sees children like Alan as a potential threat, refugees who are threatening to the material, political, and ideological well-being of America. The notion of national security, with its obsessions with Muslim terrorist or Mexican immigrant, remains blind to the rapacious everyday violence, physical as well as structural, that is taking a toll in the American psyche in the death of innocent children, in school shootings, water poisoning in Flint, Michigan, mass incarceration, suicides, and the slow death of drug and opioid addictions. This malaise can only be confronted by examining the history of dispossession, racial capitalism, and the overlooked legacy of subjugated populations, such as African Americans and Muslim and Native populations of the colonized world. The history of these communities offers a moral compass towards a non-imperial vision of global community that celebrates potential for convivial cultural pluralism. The Supreme Court's ruling on the Muslim ban ignored the multifaceted and rich history of Muslims in America because it's not part of the collective memory of the status quo histories of the United States, the more established histories. The hegemonic construction of Islam and Muslims as the other, the foreign threat, allowed Donald Trump to single Muslims out as a national security issue, a threat. Trump announced the Muslim ban a week after taking oath of office. The spontaneous protests and resistance were a heartening sign of decency remaining in the United States, but this kind of mobilization is hard to sustain given the succession of policies that target one vulnerable community population after another. The Supreme Court's endorsement of the Muslim ban in June 2018 may have emboldened the Trump administration to cast its net wider in detaining asylum seekers in the U.S.-Mexico border, splitting families by separating children from parents, and demanding billions of dollars for the border from Mexico, all under the banner of national security. A singular focus on the Trump administration or the Muslim ban ruling might not be enough to stem the tide of exclusion that will grow as long as the cultural debate of, quote, security, unquote, is defined by a narrative that projects Muslims, Mexicans, black and brown immigrants as the external threat to the homeland. This narrative is widely insinuated and reinforced by television thrillers about sleeper cells, illegal immigrants, and particularly the Islamic extremists as the most extreme case. These racist stereotypes are amplified by White House officials, including people like Frank Wuko, who oversaw the National Security Review that recommended the Muslim ban. Wuko was quoted for stating that Muslims living under non-Muslim rule will ultimately necessarily turn to violence. According to Wuko, Islam prescribes violence and warfare against unbelievers, and that Muslims resist assimilation. At this juncture, it might be helpful to look back at how black Muslims have approached politics since the 1950s, when the state turned a blind eye towards the terrorism that was being inflicted on black communities. Malcolm X did not appeal to the promise of integration or look to the legal systems to secure full citizenship or civil rights. Instead, Malcolm emphasized an ethical and political program of self-definition that highlighted the centrality of the racial violence, the dispossession, and called for a reckoning with the history. For Malcolm X, the project of liberation was not restricted to the United States, but involved colonized people all over the world, Muslim and non-Muslim. A recurring theme of his rhetoric was based on his Muslim faith and the links it created between him and the ancestors who were stolen and abducted from Africa. Thus, Islam is brought into the center of the colonial American experience from the Middle Passage to the reigning wars in Vietnam. Muhammad Ali invoked his faith to reject the draft during the Vietnam War, even at the expense of his world championship and a ban from professional boxing. These ideals were conveyed in more modest ways through the music of John Coltrane, Yusuf Lateef, and Art Blakey, whose music resulted in profound transformation in the jazz soundscape by looking eastwards and inwards to create a new sound that evoked a mood that did not harken back to Vienna, London, or Paris, but rather to Morocco, Accra, or Alabama. These artists displayed a modest humility even as they challenged the North Atlantic universals that equated the West with modern progress, democracy, and humanism. Instead, the melancholic, bluesy sound of Coltrane and the pensive world music meditations of Yusuf Lateef opened up more expansive and complex notions of freedom that resonated with the sound of decolonization. The path towards liberation was not through assimilation or through music that propped up the existing power structure, but rather in breaking through the borders to craft a new sense of self, an aesthetic experience that pays tribute to the overlooked history of the enslaved and the kinship with the colonized world. This rich history of black Muslim agitation and cultural protection might not be recognized by the imaginative geography of Orientalism and the fixations of Islamophobia that see Islam as a foreign religion or a foreign security threat. The clash of civilization narrative that has been a key factor in the resurgence of white nationalism in Europe and in America works hard to create civilizational narratives that collapse when one takes a note of the biography of slaves, the marginalized who literally built America and the modern world system. The legacy of Black Atlantic Islam lives on with contemporary artists like Lupe Fiasco and Yassine Bey, who continue to critique the American imperial politics while maintaining artistic integrity. The story of Islam in America offers a unique significance to challenge the Muslim ban and the prevailing racial politics of our times.